The frozen forests of the Ardennes carried whispers that winter. German soldiers, pressed against snow-dusted foxholes, traded stories about their newest adversaries with voices barely above a breath. These weren't the tales they told about the Russians, whom they feared with an almost primal terror, nor were they the dismissive jokes about the British, whom they grudgingly respected as fellow professionals. No, the Americans occupied a strange, contradictory space in the German military consciousness. They were simultaneously mocked and dreaded, underestimated and overwhelming, criticized for their lack of traditional soldiering and yet utterly unstoppable in their advance across Europe. When American forces first appeared in North Africa in 1942, German commanders circulated reports with barely concealed amusement. These fresh-faced troops seemed to possess every disadvantage imaginable. They moved in clusters, talking loudly enough to be heard across no man's land. Their uniforms looked pristine, almost theatrical, as if they'd stepped off a Hollywood set rather than a transport ship. German veterans, hardened by years of brutal combat across Poland, France, and the endless Russian steppes, watched these newcomers with the kind of patronizing superiority that comes from experience paid for in blood. The Americans fumbled with their equipment, got lost on simple reconnaissance missions, and seemed more interested in trading chocolate bars than learning the deadly craft of warfare. Letters home from German soldiers in those early months dripped with condescension. One panzer commander wrote to his wife that fighting the Americans would be like teaching school to children who refuse to learn. The Battle of Kasserine Pass seemed to confirm every prejudice. American forces broke and scattered under Rommel's experienced Afrika Korps, leaving behind equipment and positions in chaotic retreat. German soldiers collected American rations with delight, marveling at the luxuries these troops carried into battle. Canned fruit, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the burnt grain substitute they'd grown accustomed to. The contrast was almost offensive. Here were soldiers who brought creature comforts to war, who seemed to treat the entire enterprise as some kind of camping expedition with unfortunate shooting involved. One German sergeant recorded in his diary that the Americans fight like tourists who've taken a wrong turn. The mockery spread through the ranks, becoming part of the dark humor that sustained men through impossible circumstances. But something shifted in the months that followed. The Americans who returned to the fight in Tunisia weren't the same disorganized mob. They'd learned with a speed that unsettled their opponents. German after-action reports began noting a disturbing pattern: American forces adapted faster than any enemy they'd previously encountered. When a tactic failed, they didn't repeat it out of doctrine or tradition. They simply tried something else, improvising with a flexibility that European military academies would have considered undisciplined. A Wehrmacht officer observed that fighting Americans was like boxing someone who refused to follow the established rules, who'd throw punches from unexpected angles simply because no one told them those angles were wrong. This wasn't the methodical warfare the Germans understood. This was something else entirely. The industrial reality began to dawn slowly, then all at once. German soldiers had grown accustomed to scarcity. They rationed ammunition, salvaged parts from destroyed vehicles, and learned to make do with whatever supplies the increasingly strained logistics system could deliver. The Americans operated in a different universe. Artillery shells fell like rain, endless and devastating. When a tank was damaged, they didn't repair it, they simply abandoned it and requisitioned another. Supply trucks rolled forward in convoys so long they seemed to stretch back across the Atlantic itself. A German machine gunner in Italy wrote that he'd fired carefully aimed bursts to conserve ammunition while American positions simply hosed down entire hillsides with suppressive fire, as if bullets were infinite. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. It wasn't just that the Americans had more resources, they had so many resources that they could afford to be wasteful, careless, almost contemptuous of the logistical constraints that governed everyone else's war. The air superiority became a constant nightmare. German troops learned to move only at night, to freeze at the sound of aircraft engines, to recognize the particular growl of American fighters before they appeared over the tree-line. Daylight belonged to the enemy. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk, said they'd never experienced anything like the American air campaign. The J-bows, as they called the fighter bombers, seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. They struck supply columns, command posts, individual vehicles on country roads. A panzer commander described the Americans as fighting a three-dimensional war, where the sky was simply another front, and German forces were always exposed, always vulnerable, always being watched from above. Yet the ground combat revealed something unexpected. The American soldier, when encountered individually or in small groups, often seemed less impressive than his German counterpart. He wasn't as physically hardened, didn't possess the same instinctive fieldcraft, and frequently made tactical errors that more experienced troops would never commit. German snipers noted that American soldiers silhouetted themselves against skylines, moved predictably, and showed poor noise discipline. In close-quarters fighting, Wehrmacht veterans often prevailed through superior training and hard-won experience. But these small victories meant nothing in the larger context. For every American killed, 3 more appeared. For every position successfully defended, American artillery would reduce it to rubble, and fresh troops would simply walk through the ruins. The mechanization struck German soldiers as almost science fiction. They'd relied on horses for transport throughout the war, millions of horses, struggling through mud and snow, requiring food and care, breaking down and dying. The Americans arrived in trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, an endless parade of vehicles that moved supplies and men with mechanical efficiency. A German logistics officer calculated that a single American division possessed more motor vehicles than an entire German army group. This mobility translated into tactical flexibility that German commanders struggled to counter. American forces could concentrate overwhelming strength at a chosen point, then disperse before German reserves arrived, then concentrate again somewhere else entirely. It was warfare at a tempo the Wehrmacht simply couldn't match with its hybrid force of modern weapons and 19th-century transport. The individual American soldier remained a puzzle. He didn't fight with the ideological fervor of the Russian, who'd defend every meter of motherland with suicidal determination. He didn't possess the stoic professionalism of the British Tommy, who'd endure hardship with grim humor and steady discipline. The American seemed almost casual about warfare, as if he couldn't quite take the whole thing seriously. German soldiers noted with bewilderment that Americans would pause battles to brew coffee, would argue with their officers in ways that would result in court-martial in any proper army, and seemed more motivated by practical concerns than abstract patriotism. One captured German officer told his interrogators that American soldiers fought like they were completing an unpleasant job they wanted to finish and go home. Yet this attitude concealed something formidable. The Americans possessed an initiative that German military doctrine actively discouraged. When officers were killed, American sergeants and even privates would simply take charge, making command decisions without waiting for orders from above. They improvised solutions to tactical problems with a creativity that suggested they'd never been properly taught that certain things were impossible. In urban combat, they proved particularly dangerous. The rigid German approach to street fighting, methodical and doctrine-based, repeatedly failed against Americans who'd simply blow holes through buildings, advance through cellars, or call in artillery on their own positions if it meant destroying the enemy. A veteran of Aachen described fighting Americans in cities as combat against ghosts who refused to follow the script. The equipment told its own story. German soldiers coveted American weapons not because they were necessarily superior in design. German engineering often produced more elegant solutions, but because they worked consistently. The M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic and reliable, gave American infantry a rate of fire that bolt-action Mausers couldn't match. The bazooka, crude but effective, meant every American squad possessed anti-tank capability. German soldiers who captured American positions found themselves surrounded by material abundance that seemed almost insulting. Medical supplies, warm clothing, waterproof boots, sleeping bags, items German troops could only dream about. The Americans fought a comfortable war, relatively speaking, and this comfort translated into morale that didn't crack under pressure. The artillery became legendary, almost mythical in German accounts. American forward observers seemed to have direct lines to the gods of war. Within minutes of contact, shells would begin falling with accuracy and volume that defied belief. German forces learned that engaging Americans meant accepting that you'd soon be fighting through a steel hurricane. The proximity fuses, which detonated shells above ground for maximum fragmentation effect, caused casualties that conventional artillery never could. Veterans spoke of tree bursts that turned forests into killing zones, of barrages so intense that men went mad from the noise alone, of entire positions simply ceasing to exist under the weight of high explosive. A company commander wrote that American artillery was the great equalizer that rendered all our tactical skill meaningless. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, German perspective shifted from mockery to something approaching respect, though tinged with resentment. The Americans weren't better soldiers in the traditional sense. They weren't more courageous, more disciplined, or more tactically sophisticated. But they represented something the Germans had failed to account for, the absolute supremacy of industrial capacity over martial virtue. The Americans had turned warfare into a production problem, and they'd solved it with assembly lines and logistics networks that dwarfed anything Europe had ever conceived. They fought a modern war while the Germans, for all their tactical brilliance and technological innovation, remained partially trapped in the past. In prisoner of war camps, German soldiers would argue endlessly about the Americans. Some maintained their contempt, insisting that any nation could win wars if they had unlimited resources. Others recognized something deeper, that the American approach to warfare, chaotic and undisciplined as it seemed, represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought. The age of the professional soldier, the military aristocrat, the warrior class, all of it was ending. The Americans heralded an era where wars would be won by economies and industries, where the factory worker mattered more than the field marshal, where logistics trumped tactics every single time. The final German assessment of American GIs contained layers of contradiction that never fully resolved. They were amateurs who somehow won, individualists who functioned as an unstoppable collective, wealthy soldiers who fought with unexpected tenacity, and representatives of a nation that approached war as a problem to be solved rather than a test of national character. The Germans had expected to fight soldiers; instead, they encountered the leading edge of an industrial civilization that had decided to win and possessed the means to make that decision reality. Understanding this distinction explains why German veterans emerged from the war with such complex feelings about their American adversaries, neither simple respect nor simple contempt, but rather a troubled recognition that they'd been fighting the future itself, and the future had proven utterly indifferent to their courage, skill, and sacrifice.